Well, thank you so much, Laura, and thank you for everyone that's here. I see we've got quite the crowd, so hopefully what I present to you today is very helpful. Before I introduce myself or do anything along those lines, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to use the chat. And I'm going to ask you to answer this question that I have here on this first slide, and that is, what issues do teachers face today with teaching grammar? So if you could just put your answer in the chat, that would be fantastic. And Jane says texting. Many teachers have not been taught grammar. Ah, yes. Vanetta, I would agree with that. Now it's just ELA, text talk, sentence structure. Tracy, I would agree with the time thing for sure. Yeah, Jane, it really seems to be like grammar seems to kind of just be this thing that's pushed off to the side, and we'll just get to it when we get to it. Lack of formal language. Yes, we're going to be actually talking about that today, formal versus informal language. So all of these things that I'm seeing you put into the chat, and keep going, guys. This is all about you. This isn't about me. This is about us having a great conversation and trying to come up with some solutions together. So, yeah, like these are all issues that are definitely at the forefront of every conversation that I have with teachers. And so we're going to dive into some of those things. Yes, in ESL, and I've got some actually helpful hints for ESL teachers as well. So hopefully some of these things can help out that we do today. So I'm just going to click through, and I'm not going to put my presentation into presentation mode. I'm actually going to just leave it this way because it's easier for me to click through and might be a little bit easier for you. My name is Jeremy Hyler, though. I am a 6th and 7th grade English and science teacher. I teach at a very small school district. We have probably just in my middle school, or our middle school, there are approximately, I'd say, around 130 students right now between 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. So very small class sizes. I think my biggest class size I have is about 25. I am literally right out in the middle of a cornfield. That's where our school is at. Very big agricultural community. But it's a great community. It's a great school to work for. I love my superintendent. He allows me to do things like this and take days off and go to some great presentations that were earlier in the day and yesterday. I'm also a community ambassador for the National Council of Teachers of English, heading into my 2nd year of doing that. And I'm also a media literacy innovator for KQED. You can follow me on Twitter. I encourage you to follow each other, collaborate, build that personal learning network. You can check out my website at jeremyhyler40.com. And also you can email me at any time if you have questions or you need access to something that you may be having trouble getting access to that I show you today. So that's me. So from the great state of Michigan. So that's where I'm from, and we actually had a snow day today. So so I'm gonna try not to bore you too much, but I'm gonna talk about history of grammar. I promise you won't fall asleep, but the history debate, or the grammar debate, has been there for over 100 years. Even when schools were first kind of on the scene with things, there was still this debate on how grammar should be taught in the classroom. And the big question is, should we explicitly teach grammar in English classroom? Well, and this has been going on for many, many years, and it's highlighted by professionals like Constance Weaver. Jeff Anderson is another great resource in terms of teaching grammar. And both of them obviously agree that grammar should not be taught alone, but it should be taught within context. Well, that's not any different than what NCTE, the National Council of Teachers of English, has proposed. And actually, they propose that there should be mentor text with it, and it shouldn't be something that is taught alone. And perhaps there are other paths. Now, obviously, I feel that there should be other paths today, just because of what some of the things that you folks mentioned, which is the idea of this technology and this text talk, this text lingo, whatever you would like to call it, formal versus informal. So yes, we do need to be looking at some other paths here when we're looking at teaching grammar. Um, so some of the other things, just a real quick funny image. This was an image that was created quite a few years ago, that perhaps by the year 2000 we would just be hooking headphones up to kids and just pumping in the information and they would get it. So unfortunately that's not the way things go, and so we have to find other ways. When it comes to grammar, we definitely have to find other ways to teach them. So I have another question for you, keeping you involved and participating, and so you're not just hearing me talk the entire time. And again, answer in the chat if you could, please. But to what extent should tech be blamed for grammar issues our students demonstrate today? Should we be blaming technology for the fact they just don't know grammar skills, or what are your thoughts here? So I'm kind of curious. So take a few minutes and participate in the chat, and I'll see what you got to say. Danny, I definitely believe that. I believe you in terms of slang has always been around. That is for sure. And we're going to talk about that code switching. Like your thoughts there, Tracy. Katie, same thing. Like your thoughts there. Katie, I'm wondering if maybe you could explain a little bit what you mean by people don't care. Like they just don't care that they're being formal, informal. Brooke, I agree. That does have the ability to correct it. Oh, so I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Safa. It's just asking you to answer the question from the slide. To what extent should technology be blamed for the way students use grammar today? Danny, I agree with that, and I also think about how we dress to go to church on a daily basis, or on Sundays too, because those of us that go to church, like I see people in shorts, and I'm guilty of actually wearing shorts to church as well. No problem, Safa. Yes, Susan, I agree with that, and we have to definitely help them with that part. Well, the responses that I'm getting from you guys are awesome. You guys are rock stars. I really appreciate this, and you are definitely forward thinkers. And so my next slide is that yes, texting and tech is not to blame for this. Yes, does it contribute to the problem? Absolutely, it contributes to the problem, but it's not the problem. It wasn't like all of a sudden, when phones and everything came onto the scene, that students instantly started having really poor grammar. That wasn't the case. But Kristen Holly Turner, who is out of Fordham University, she's written a couple books, and she actually co-authored a book with with Dr. Troy Hicks, my co-author. For NCTE, and she talks about DigiTalk and some of the articles that she's written, and she talked about this idea that students have these spaces that they write in, and that we have to honor these spaces that they write in, and respect the spaces that they write in. And that's kind of what I'm going to be formulating my presentation around, and show you what I want you to work on today, and something that you can actually take back to your classrooms, or wherever you're taking them back to your schools, and you can use. But she does talk about not necessarily requiring students to stop talking or to stop their informal texting and talking, but to show them that there's differences, to show them when it's appropriate to write informally and when it's appropriate to write formally. And then she's got some other articles out there too. She's got one on code switching, which is awesome. It goes all the way back to the discussion of ebonics, and that this idea of slang has been, just that was mentioned earlier, that has been around for many years. And so that we have to be understanding that it looks a little bit different today, in terms of the fact that they have cell phones now instead of doing it personally. Um, so I'm just reading through some of your comments here. Students are writing a standardized way. Um, we give more grace with grammar mistakes, especially with our informal. AI today is a whole job for terrible grammar users. I'm just reading your comment, Katie. I live in a rural community, and most people seem to speak type text informally, as long as they can understand the meaning. Yeah, and that's really what our students are doing too. Our students are writing in this informal way, and it's a way for them to understand each other. We have a young lady in our school right now that can read text informally and everything else, but when it comes to any kind of formal text and trying to get her to read and understand, she struggles with it a lot. So that's interesting that you bring that point up. So this idea that I'm going to bring to you today, and this instructional strategy that I use with my students, I want to give a little bit of background. First of all, I use the Triple E framework in my classroom. Our keynote speaker, Liz Kolb, in her Learning First, Technology Second. She's a great lady. She wrote the foreword for our book, and but however, that's not what I'm here to discuss. I'm here to discuss the strategy I use in my classroom, but really this idea of extend, enhance, and engage. And this idea that what I really like is making sure that what I'm giving my students, that they are extending it beyond their classroom. So what I'm hoping is that what I show you today, you will see that students can take this and apply it to what they do outside of the classroom. It's not only engaging, but it does extend. So I kind of want to give you a little bit of background in terms of what I do in my classroom before we dive into the meat and potatoes of this. I use a program called Grammar Flip, and I flip my grammar instruction in my classroom. So I am taking very little time in terms of being up in front of the classroom, being the sage on the stage, and teaching my students about grammar lessons. Because let's be honest, grammar is really kind of boring to teach in general, in terms of the actual lesson. And so I use Grammar Flip, and I'm just going to click over real quick and show you some of the things with Grammar Flip. And show you the inside of it. Grammar Flip is a freemium, which means that you get some things for free. There's a yearly subscription. I think the yearly subscription is it might be like $100. I'm not entirely sure on the price of it. My school district does not pay for it. This does come out of my pocket. It's just been a reoccurring thing, so I'm not sure what the price is for this. Grammar Flip is great because it saves me time in the classroom with this, but it also gives me that lead into doing activities like what I'm going to show you today. But what Grammar Flip is that you can create your own classes. You can see that I have 2 classes here for 6th grade. And then what Grammar Flip does is they break it down into 3 different levels. They have the foundations, the building blocks, and the advanced. My 6th graders are just now on the building blocks, beginning sentences. And so if you click on this, then what it does is it breaks it down into the different lessons. And we're actually down here. I'll just scroll down real quick. We've been working on these different types of sentences, independent clauses, and trying to construct sentences out of different things. So this not only is it really cool in terms of the lesson, there is a video, there is also a slideshow that goes with it, and then the students can take quizzes and they can do writing prompts with it. They can retake quizzes as many times as they want to. There's 3 different types of quizzes that are with it. And so how I have my students do it is they have a new grammar lesson that's assigned on Monday. They have until Thursday to complete it, and then Friday we move into this activity that goes along with it. So instead of having the homework outside of class, the homework is essentially inside the class in terms of how how flipped classrooms actually are supposed to look. And then you can also look at your students' progress in terms of how they're doing, and it'll highlight if they're in the green, they're doing really well. Yellow is not so bad, but red not so good either. So So it breaks it down, really user friendly, not difficult to use for the students either, or for the teachers or the students. So I really enjoy it, but um, it is a stepping stone for my students for this. Um, so that's how I start things off with my students, and then I told you that at the end of the week, like Thursday and Friday, what we're doing is this activity. Well, I'd like to introduce you to the activity, and I want you to, I'm going to have you participate in the activity today. So I think you'll really enjoy this. So this activity is, I call this Grammar Slam, or I call this their grammar template. It has a couple different names. My students really enjoy it. But I created this grammar template quite a few years ago. I went to a digital literacy institute in Rhode Island with Renee Hobbs, and one of the projects that we had to do was create something to take back to our classrooms. And I created this with another individual. And what we did is we put on here the different spaces that students write in. So after the initial grammar flip lesson that the students actually get, that instruction that they get from watching the grammar flip video, then we move into this activity with this template. And so these are different spaces, and these can be interchangeable. If you feel like a student or your group of students do not write with or do not write in these spaces, you can always change it. Instagram seems to be, and Snapchat seem the one that kind of flip flops back and forth in terms of changing. I know a lot of my sixth graders are not into Twitter. I've kept that one this year because they chose to keep it. So I give them a little bit of buy-in in terms of what they want to have on here. And you can also take different pieces of this out. But what I do is I start with a conversation with them, and we talk about the different spaces that they write in, but then we get into this conversation. It leads in this conversation about formal versus informal. So we will take time and talk about Google Documents. We'll take time and talk about Snapchat, texting, etc. And we talk about, is that a formal space or is that an informal space? And so I will lead them into some of some of the conversation. Like I will say, for example, okay, so Google document, you are writing this argumentative paper for so-and-so, for Mr. Hyler. And so is that going to be a formal space where you have to have everything correct? You can't have any digital talk, any of those things. And so we go through and we would label this particular up here on the whiteboard. We would put an F for formal. And then we would talk about Snapchat, and we would talk about, well, who are you talking to? Most of the time it's talking to your friends, and or you're talking to people that you're not talking to your teachers on Snapchat, hopefully. And so we agree that that's an informal space. But then what gets tricky is, and what I really like with my students, and my students are always the ones that start having the conversation amongst themselves, and it's really neat to see them transform into this, is when we start getting into the texting and the emails. And I asked them that question. I'm like, is it formal or is it informal? And so what they do is they start having this conversation about, well, audience. And I'm like, you're absolutely right. It does depend on your audience. And so they're like, well, if I'm texting my mom, I tend to be more formal. Or if I'm texting my friend, I'm very informal. And I'm like, well, what about emails? And they're the same thing. So the audience piece of it. So it really does lead into some really good conversations that can occur with your students. And so I would encourage you, if you use this grammar template, that you definitely start with having that conversation about formal and informal spaces. And the reason why I ask teachers and educators to do that is because we don't want to take away the spaces that they're writing in, and we don't want to tell them you shouldn't write this way, but we want to make sure that we're respecting their spaces. And we're basically telling our students that, hey, okay, I respect the spaces that you're writing in, but let's talk about when it's okay to write like that and when it's not okay to write like that. And so that's why I have this grammar template for them to work through. And so that is the start of doing this grammar template with my students. Is there any questions at this point before I dive into kind of what the students will be doing besides the formal and informal talk? And you can post your questions in the chat if you have any at this point. I'll give it just a minute. So what we would do, or what I would do with this template after we have that informal and that formal conversation, is I then will give them a starter. And what I mean by that is, so this particular, or I'm sorry, last week we were talking about independent clauses. And so what we do is we go back and we look into the story that we're reading, the story or the novel that we're reading at that time. And so last week we were reading a historical nonfiction piece about the Donner Party, and then the westward pass and heading out west. I'm sorry, that was what we're reading this week. Last week we were reading a short story called Priscilla in the Wimps, and so it was a very short fictional piece. And so what we do is we go through and we try to find a sentence that has some independent clauses in it. On the next slide, you will see that there is a link that you can follow if you're in my presentation, and that link will bring you to the grammar template, or what I'm pulling up right here. And what I do is we always start as a class, and when I do this, I always go through it with the class a couple times. So I give them the sentence, and what I have my students then do is we go through, we read the sentence. His neck was popping like gunfire and his head's bowed under the immense weight of their forearm. And then what I would do with my students is I would have them identify what the independent clauses are in this sentence. And so they're able to do that. And then we talk about how this is this is a formal space in terms of the Google document. And so this is how we would leave the sentence. But then what I do is I have them pull out, I will say to them, okay, so let's pull out one of those independent clauses and let's put it into Snapchat. So for example, if I were to take the independent clause from that sentence, the first part says his neck was popping like gunfire. I would tell them, okay, so go out, let's find an image, a free image on the internet that would replicate that independent clause, his neck was popping like gunfire. And then put in a little sentence or a little typing part on Snapchat like you normally do. And so I want to see what that would look like in your writing space. So if you were to send that independent clause to one of your friends, what would that look like? So it's going to be an informal space. And then what I would have them do is then go on to texting and say, okay, what does that sentence look like in a text that you're sending to a friend? And then we would go through, and because we would decide that email is more of a formal space. Okay, so what does that sentence look like in a formal space? What does that look like in a Facebook space? And we usually decide that Facebook can go either way. I usually have my students do it formally, just because of the fact that we want that. I always want that balance with the template in terms of having 3 formal, 3 informal. And then we have Twitter, and I always tell them #crazy. You can go #crazy all you want with this one. So what would that sentence in that informal space, what would that independent clause look like in that space? And so they're working on this template, and I always have them do it with partners. That way they can play around with it together and be creative. And I'm always really curious as to what they come away with. Now, before I have you go out and play a little bit, I'll just share with you a couple of this example comes from a year that I did with my 8th graders when we were reading Behind Rebel Lines with Seymour Wright. And the sentence we were dealing with adjectives. Everything is working exceptionally efficient at the supply tent that's as big as the courthouse. And so then they put the pictures in to Snapchat, and then that's an older format of Snapchat, and then what it looked like in a text message, and what it looked like in Twitter, Facebook. My favorite one is the email on this one, where the students really got quite ridiculous in terms of how they responded to me. I had some pretty good students, and they were very formal in their writing, but like I told them, I said, I have never had an 8th grader write like that before. So you can kind of see how they went through and they worked this template. And so that's an example. And then I have another example on the other slide too, which is just dealing with compound sentences. And you can see a very simple, this would be a lower grade. You can see a very simple in terms of how students were actually using this particular template. And you can see at Instagram, there's an old Instagram picture that's up there. So I'm gonna just pause here for a minute. And yeah, thanks, Laura, for doing that. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, I think some of you are on that grammar template. slide, which is great. And on my presentation slide, you can see I gave you some directions. What I want you to do is to make sure you make a copy of the template so you can edit. So you actually have to go in and say, make a copy. And then I would like you to just work on each writing platform, altering each writing platform, and feel free to add, delete text boxes, and don't forget about the grammar rules. But I want you to use that sentence that I gave you, which is a sentence my sixth graders used last week. His neck was popping like gunfire and his head bowed under the immense weight of their forearms. So pick an independent clause, and what would that look like in Snapchat? What would that look like in texting? What would that look like in email? And it's not a race. I'm going to give you probably like 5 minutes, and then I'll ask if anybody wants to just kind of put in chat what they did or what your thoughts were on this template. And I'll also share with you the bottom part of this template too, in the Google Slides, where it says official convention and rule, and in my own words. And so I'll talk to you about what I have my students do there. And then I will talk to you about the application process for this. Like, where do my students go from here? Because you're probably wondering like, hey, this is all great, Jeremy, but like, how did the students use this? How do they remember their grammar skills? So I will talk to you about what I would have my students do from here. So if you have questions, I can answer them in the chat. And if there's anybody else that has any comments or you're confused in anything, you can go ahead. Yes, and there's only one slide in the link. That's it. Oh, but you have to make a copy, so please don't forget to make a copy. And I know there's a copyright thing on the bottom, but you have my permission to use it, so go ahead and use it. So I'm going to stop talking now because I'm rambling. Laura, Susan's got a question in the chat about not being able to log into Zoom with no audio.
Oh, let's see.
I don't know if that's anything you can help her with.
Well, okay, I will try to address that. Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great question. So how parents can help their children in this after school, typically this is done in class. But what I actually have my students, anything outside of class, in terms of helping, how can parents help their children with this particular thing. One of the activities that I have my students do, and it's not anything that I require my students to do, but because once we get into the different grammar things, what I have my students do is I have them be smart about using their technology outside of school, and say, okay, so you're in the store or you're driving past things and you see all these marquees, you see these signs in the store. What I'd like you to do is I would love for you to take some pictures of where you see grammar not being used correctly. And then what they do is they take a picture and then I ask them to send it to me, and they have to tell me what the rule is and what's wrong with what they're seeing. And then what I do with that is I give them some extra credit for it. But then what I do with it is it's a great time filler. So if you have like that 5 minutes at the end of class, or you have that 6 minutes at the end of class, you can bring it up and say, okay, what's wrong with this? And you can say, so-and-so found this, but what's wrong with it? And then you can reveal to them, what the rule was. And so parents can definitely help their students find those grammar mistakes that we see out in public. I know just around in my community where I live in, they're all over the place. So, I mean, and I'm not trying to insult anybody's intelligence, but going back to what some people said earlier in the chat, that there seems to be this nod to not caring about how grammar is, but this could be a great way to get parents involved as well. Give you a couple more minutes as you're playing around with the template. And as you're playing around with the template and you're thinking about like younger grades, I've done this with undergrads, and undergrads love it, especially if you get into political stuff with them. They love to be able to like throw some things on there. But with younger grades, you could always reduce the template. So there's only like 3 things on the template or 4 things. Sometimes the template can be overwhelming to the younger grades. I'm also going to talk about how you can apply it to other subject areas too, because I have a colleague that uses it in other subject areas. So if you want to share something in the chat, you can go ahead and do that as we continue to move forward. I want to make sure we're conscious of our time, and I know that Laura uh, would like me to leave some time for some questions at the end. So I want to make sure again that we're conscious of time with things and we're moving through this. So feel free to post them, and I'm just going to keep talking. And if anything comes up, I will stop you on. I will stop myself, and we'll address those. Underneath, as you can see with the official convention and rule, and in my own words, underneath that template, in that speaker part, what I have my students do is whatever official rule we're working on or convention, I always have my students write down what that is, and then they have to put it in their own words. And how I always present this to my students is I always say to them, hey, if you had a classmate that was absent and wasn't here for that lesson, what would you say to them? So if you had to describe to them what an independent clause was, what would you write down in that spot in terms of in their own words? I feel that this helps take ownership of it. And I also feel like if by putting it in their own words, it's a lot better for the students in terms of being able to remember it. So that's why we added this little part down at the bottom of the template. Now, in terms of grading this too, I do give points for completion for this, but really for me, it's a formative assessment. I'm looking to see if the students understand the difference between formal and informal writing, number one, and number two, that they do understand the rule in terms of what is an independent clause or whatever rule or convention that we're working on for that particular week. And we don't do the template every week. This is just one instructional strategy that I use with my students. But I always give them it's more of a completion grade. And then when it comes to applying the rules in their writing, then I give them more of a summative grade on that. And I'll explain that in just a minute. I'm just checking on the chat real quick. Wasn't sure how to manipulate some of these areas. Yeah. In the short time that we have, that is there's text boxes and stuff, and some of those things I have to go through in detail with my 6th graders in terms of like adding a text box or taking out some of the text boxes that may already be there. And I would also encourage you to take the idea, and then if you want to create your own, you could also create your own. Is there another way to reach narrative grammar except use or telling or writing stories? Oh, that's a great question. I'd really have to reflect on that one for a few minutes and for a little while. It's a great question, Safa, and I'd have to think about that for a little bit. This can be applicable to outside of the curriculum area. One of my colleagues who just received Regional Teacher of the Year, he teaches science classes, and he watches this Charles Darwin video with his students, and he says it's the most boring video in the world, but he says it's really informative. It's got really great stuff, but he goes, it's so old that it's just the students aren't engaged. And so what he did is he used the template in a different way in terms of getting the students engaged and for the video, and he had them use the different spaces, still formally and informally, but to get information from the video. My favorite one on this, and I always share this out loud, is that the Twitter one down in the bottom left where it says, just got married. I hope me and my cousin Emma share a happy life together and have many children. #family marriage, #cousins engaged. So I always really like that one a lot. And his students did an excellent job. And this is just one of the examples that he shared with me for his class. So I'm coming to an end. One thing I wanted to share with you in terms of the application process is that once my students go through and we have looked at their grammar templates and I have graded them, given them their feedback and given them that completion grade, we have some conversations in class about the different ways that independent clauses are being used, or adjectives, whatever the case may be. Whatever writing unit we are on, whatever piece of writing we're working on, what I require them to do, let's just take independent clauses because that's what we've been doing today. What I would have my students do is, now when they write their argument paper or their narrative paper or whatever it is that they're doing, they have to highlight 5 independent clauses in their formal writing assignment they gave to me. In that way I can see, and I would have them highlight it in blue. And then I might have them highlight 5 adjectives in green. And that way I can see there's my application that I'm seeing my students actually do within the classroom. And I can see that they understand the concepts. And then, as I was explaining earlier, extending that using the Triple E framework and extending that and going out, then students can go out and capture, using their cell phones, they can capture different images of where grammar has been poorly used. So that is my grammar template. It has been very successful for me. It is ever evolving in terms of things with my students. One of the things I'm looking at doing with this in the future is, because I'm really getting into hyperdocs, and I'm actually thinking about having my students incorporating this template into a hyperdoc somehow, and if they can do some inquiry with grammar and seeing how that might work. So it's been ever changing. It's changed over the years. Like I said, the different platforms change. Maybe TikTok should be on there because students are on TikTok all the time. So there's lots of different ways that this can be manipulated and changed. Kind of like, what's next for you? What are some questions? Do you want to further research this? You want to implement it into your classes? Maybe take it back to some staff meetings and discuss it. When I say read the book, I'm referring specifically to From Texting to Teaching, because this is where it comes out of. And I know this is a shameless plug, but that is where this idea comes out of, is from the book that I co-authored with Dr. Troy Hicks in terms of teaching grammar in the digital age. This is just one of the activities that we have. And we do have some English second language stuff in there in terms of with vocabulary. So that's worth checking out too. But I'll go back to that slide. Is there anybody who wants to try it, or they want to try it with their students? They have any questions? I have very tough skin. So if you didn't like it, and there's things you wanted to see changed, you can let me know. It does. It's like anything else. I always feel like you got to take time to play around with it in order for it to kind of see how it works. And I know that's not it's not very indicative of. And Jane says, "Need your book." Well, thank you, Jane. And I agree with you, Tracy. I think it can be used for more than grammar as well. I appreciate your feedback. And like I said, I am not a person. I like constructive criticism. So please give any that you have. So I just feel like we have to meet our students where they're at, and we can't. Technology is not going away. Texting is not going away, but we do have to teach them how to write responsibly between formal and informal spaces. That's for sure. Any other thoughts? Anybody put anything in the chat? Like a bone to chicken, yes. You definitely have to have grammar, and it has to be, yeah. So I always tell my students, because whenever they have problems with writing, I'm always like, well, you can talk a lot, so you should be able to write a lot. So I said, even if you don't talk very well, you should still be able to write and get some things out. So any other thoughts that you guys have today on this? I want to make sure we're all conscious of time. And there are some additional resources. One of those additional resources that I wanted to, one of the additional resources I wanted to bring up, and a lot of people don't know about it, is by Graham and Perrin. It's the second resource on that slide. It's the Writing Next report, and they talk about effective strategies to improve writing of adolescents in middle and high school. If you have not checked that out, please do so. They talk about sentence structure, and they talk about sentences kind of being like puzzle pieces, being able to put them together, take them apart. And it's the approach that I take with my students. And it's helped greatly. And just using mentored sentences to help in terms with sentence or understanding students understanding sentence structure and grammar. So definitely a good quality read, and I believe it's free online. So you just click on it, and I think the report comes up online. So definitely worth checking out if you have not checked that out. Um, I know my co-author has said that several times. He's presented on different things, and he's amazed that people have not discovered that yet. So hopefully you can check that out. So, well, I thank everybody for participating, and I'm going to hand it back over to Laura because I think she's got some closing comments for you, because I think we're at 4:45 where she wanted me to stop. So,
Perfect timing. Perfect timing. Yes, thank you so much for sharing all of these great resources. I love that it's so practical, and teachers can go ahead and start using this tomorrow if they wanted to. This is awesome. One thing I did want to ask you, if you have a moment,
yeah.
is just this idea of, I know right now, this is, you're kind of simulating the conversations of using this in those platforms. How do you talk
Mhm.
about them actually translating that over the screen? So in terms of like student to student communication when they're at home with each other, if that makes sense. Do you
Yeah,
have
and
those
that's
kind of conversations?
yeah, it's really interesting because my students will get very upset. First of all, we start talking about texting, and we start talking about text talk, and how they talk to each other. And it's amazing how students get really upset at each other when they will type something really long and really formal, and then all the response they get is the letter K for okay. And it's
Uh-huh.
amazing how students will get super mad. They're like, "I'm so mad, Mr. Hyler, that they didn't respond with it." And I'm like, okay. I'm like, let's carry that over into real life conversation. So if someone's spilling their heart out to you about something, and you go, okay, how do you think that person's going to feel? And we
Mhm,
also
mhm,
talk about the idea of confrontation, and we call it keyboard courage in our school, and making sure
mhm,
that you don't have that keyboard courage. If you have keyboard courage, you better be able to say that in real life too. And then
mhm,
that's some of the stuff we work on with our social emotional learning lessons that we have in our school district. But yeah, we definitely try to have those conversations about, making sure that any conversation that you have on screen, you need to make sure you can have that same conversation outside of your screen or away from your screen too. And if you're not going to say it on your screen, then you don't say it in real life. Or
mhm.
how are you going to appropriately respond to somebody if they're spilling their guts to you, or you're trying to have a serious conversation with them and you respond with just a letter?
Yes. Yeah. I love how it translates, and that idea of, I always think of it as digital citizenship is just good
Hmm.
citizenship, because the reality is that most of their communication is digital now. So
Hmm.
teaching them those skills, and I think you kind of alluded to this about, um, it's better to show them all the possibilities and the things that they can do with the technology and how they can communicate, rather than constantly telling them what they can't do.
Right.
So I like that. I like your perspective from that. So, yeah, is there anybody else that wanted to jump in here? We have a couple minutes before I close things up. You've got some great feedback, and I really appreciate the engagement of you all in this chat. That always makes these sessions so much more interactive and lively, especially for the presenter, so that they don't feel like they're just talking to the screen. So thank you for engaging, everybody.
Yes, thank you
um,
very much.
um, so yeah, and you do have the link to Jeremy's presentation, and then he has shared some great additional resources and also his contact information. So make sure that you stay connected with him. And so I think I will go ahead and share my screen, Jeremy, if you
Yeah,
are wrapped up. Okay.
I will